the C7 Z06. With the help of our sponsor Autotempest and our friends at GM Performance, this is going to be a deep dive on the very last manual front engine Corvette Z06. In this video, you'll be hearing directly from some of the engineers responsible for the LT4 or the Supercharged V8 that makes this the most powerful front engine Z06 ever. You'll be seeing a street drive and track drive with two different Z06 Corvettes. This 2015 entirely stock Z06 3LZ with Z07 package, and a different Z06 that's been lightly modified that we've been granted permission to beat mercilessly at Autobahn Country Club. So that, before we head into the shop, let's talk about the interior and exterior of the C7 Z06. Now, starting with the exterior side of things, this, I think, is the best looking modern Corvette. I think the styling of this car is modern, yet classic. You have the long hood look of this thing. It is fairly aggressive without being overdone, and I think the styling of this car will age very well. When you compare this to a C8 Z06, or a car that I currently own, while that car looks ultra aggressive, has the discount exotic mid-engine car look, I think a lot of that styling is definitely here and now, but I will leave that up to you. When it comes to the interior space of this car, I won't say, particularly for the asking price of the C7s when they were new, this is the nicest place to be. But as someone who lived with a C7 Grand Sport for 4 years, this is a perfectly pleasant place to be, and you could, if you were brave or stupid like I was, use this essentially as a daily driver. There is good visibility, better visibility in this car than the C8, particularly out of the sides and rear. There are less blind spots in this car, and frontward visibility is better. There is reasonable headroom, more headroom in the C7 than in the C8. I'm around 6 foot tall, just under 6'1", and I fit in this car with a helmet with minimal adjustment. That's not something you can say about the C8. And in many ways, I feel that the ergonomics in the C7 are superior to the C8. Not that I mention the visibility, but you don't have the wall of HVAC in the center, which means the controls are more logically laid out. They all fall right to hand. Everything's easy to use. Other than that, though, I think the next thing to talk about is price, because that's honestly the sticky point of cars like this. And that's where our title sponsor, Autotempest, comes in. Autotempest honestly does not get enough credit for being an enthusiast-run search engine. The owner, Nathan, is very involved with productions like this because he likes content. He likes learning about cars, and without them, this video would not be possible. And they've sponsored some of our older videos as well. So please give them a huge thank you in the comment section. Autotempest is a search aggregate website, which means it links you to listings from websites like Cars.com, Hemmings, and TrueCar, and it even lets you compare nationwide Craigslist and Facebook Marketplace listings. And they allow you to search by keyword, trim level, gearbox, year, location. It is how Mark and I find cars that we buy. It's actually how we found our lovely Nissan Murano Cross Cabriolet. Now, let's talk about price. It is a big spread. On the cheap end, 2015s like this are the lowest price. Automatics being even lower priced than manuals because they made a lot more of them. The cheapest cars that don't have the Z07 package, which is the performance option for this, which gives you aero, carbon ceramic brakes, and some other things we're going to talk about in the shop, make these cars more expensive. 2015 with Z07 is probably in the mid-60s. As you work your way up, 2017s, 2018s, 2019s can balloon that price all the way up to almost $100,000 or more, depending on miles. The big price spread. I think the happy price point for C7 Z06 is in the 60s to 70s. This car offers a lot. It's a very unique experience. So with that out of the way, let's head into the shop where I'm going to put this thing up in the air and walk you through some of the technical details of the chassis and the car before you hear directly from the engineers that worked on the engine. In the shop with another Corvette. So before we talk about the drivetrain and the suspension, let's talk about body and chassis. From a body perspective, this has the first wide body introduced on the C7 generation Corvette. It's essentially just about 3 inches wider than the narrow body Stingray. This body was also shared identically with the Grand Sport. The ZR1, which was the top dog Corvette of this era, made a couple subtle changes. When it comes to the wideness of the car, that's for a couple of reasons. For extra cooling, obviously you have bigger inlets in the front to feed the oil cooler, the intercooler, and of course the 6.2 liter supercharged V8. You have larger hood vents to help extract some of that air. The ducting on the rear fenders is 50% larger to feed the trans and diff cooler with more air. The rear openings behind the headlights or by the headlights are also larger. All of these things combine to better cooling. This also has to fit much wider wheels and tires. It's 285 front, 335 rears. The fronts are 19 by 10. The rears are 20 by 12. You also have a different aero package to the C7 Z06 and all the wide-body Corvettes. So the base aero package, they call Stage 1, had just under 50 pounds of downforce, I think it's like 42 or 43, at 150 miles an hour. What that really means is there's no lift, but not a lot of actual downforce. The Stage 2 cars, which essentially get a slightly bigger spoiler in the front and winglets in the back, it makes at 150 miles an hour about 187 pounds of downforce. Then the Stage 3, which is available on Z07 cars like this 2015 3LZ, so top trim Z07 car, made around 350-ish pounds of downforce at 150 miles an hour. In 2015, when this car came out, that made this the most aero-capable Corvette ever. And to put in perspective, when Pratt & Miller and the race teams were developing the C7R, the race car, they actually didn't have to work that much, and reducing lift in this car was more about managing air and adding downforce when needed. Unlike in the C5 or the C6, this car didn't have all of those aero deficiencies. The body structure in this car is also far more rigid. While from a top-down perspective, the C5, C6, and C7 all look like iterative changes, right? They're all transverse leaf springs front and rear. They're all double wishbone. They're all a mix of composite and aluminum. But for the C7 era, they made the biggest step forward in body structure. When you talk to some of the engineers who worked on all the eras of Corvettes, a lot of these guys are still working on the C8s, and they talk about how for every generation, they only had enough budget to fix one thing. And for the C7, before they went to the obviously mid-engine architecture of the C8, they finally had the budget to fix the body structure. So the coupe, the base coupe C7 Z06, is about 60% more rigid than an old C6. And a C7 convertible Z06, yes, you could get these cars with a manual, with an aero package, and you could also get them as a convertible, was 20% more rigid than the old C6 Z06, which was more rigid than the base C6. So a lot went into this. For example, if you look at the front subframe, it's been hollowed out. There's some honeycombing to it. It's 20% lighter than the old front subframes and yet more rigid. If you look at the steering rack, it's now EPS. It's far more rigid than the old steering rack, which was hydraulic. The actual control arms are been hollowed out. They're stronger and they're lighter than they used to be. A lot of these iterative changes have made this a far more sophisticated body structure. But the thing about the C7 and honestly all the Corvettes is you have full alignment capability, which is exactly what you want in a sports car like this. And you have MR dampers, which are a pro and a con depending on who you are, but the MR damper technology for the C7 era was the third generation. They moved to a dual pass coil, which allowed it to react faster. It gave it a bigger breadth of capability, meaning it could go firmer and it could go softer and quicker than it used to be able to. This being a Z07 car gets the most aggressive brake and suspension package. When it comes to the rest of the chassis, obviously you have an E-differential in the back. This is GM's E-diff. They've had it around now for many iterations at this point. Essentially, it's a pump with a differential in the rear that changes its locking ratios based upon drive mode and what you're doing with the steering, throttle application, and suspension modes. They all talk to one another. This, unlike the Grand Sport, is a vehicle you have to drive around the rear. The Grand Sport was a little bit more forgiving with its torque applications, a little bit less tail happy. The Z06, you definitely notice all the power this car has. You have an 8-speed automatic, which is not great. They had some cooling issues with it, which you're going to hear from some of the engineers, but essentially it's dated this car. In my opinion, it's the weak link of the C7. If you can get this as a manual, unless you're just doing drag racing, that is not the gearbox I would get the 7-speed. There are some issues with it, which we're going to talk about when we drive this on the street and on the track, but it is a much better fit for this car. They made some changes for cooling in this car. In 2017, they made a change to the intercooler setup, get a little bit more coverage. You could also add an auxiliary or an additional flat radiator in this car to further reduce some of the overheating problems of this. The automatic gearbox has got a calibration change. like 2017 or 2018, around that time period, for less aggressive shifts to, again, help reduce some of the overheating problems that the engine and the gearbox had. They did a lot of iterative changes, and I lastly mentioned in 2019, this car got a suspension tuning change to get rid of some of the twitchiness in the car. I had a 2019 Grand Sport, and it did go a long way in making this feel like a far more balanced vehicle. You'll run into the odd leak from a cooler or a line, but again, these are almost 10-year-old cars at this point. So let's hear from Jordan Lee and the engineering team.
All right, I'm Jordan Lee, Chief Engineer, Small Block Engines.
I'm Mike Kasiba, I'm Assistant Chief Engineer, Small Block Engines. I've got responsibility for the performance car LT4s currently. At the time we launched the LT4, though, I was actually a lead engineer, so got a little background in that space too.
Assistant Chief Engineers on Small Block, and going back to the LT4 way back when started development, I was a fuel system engineer, and the big to-do on the LT4 was to get the biggest single piston DI fuel pump on that engine. So developed, launched that, and then I took over the job Mike just said he had as lead engineer at that time, and then kind of saw it through the launch there in that role as well.
Yep. And I'm Ian Lee. I'm the design system engineer. I'm currently on the LT6 and LT7, but way back when I was still a design system engineer because I've been doing this job for 16 years now. But prior to that, yeah, so in those days, I did work on the LT4 and the other Gen 5 engines. And prior to that, I was actually a design release engineer for intake manifolds and superchargers.
So let's start off with, when did development of the LT4 start, and was the C7 Z06 drivetrain always going to be FI? Many moons ago, when we talked about the C6 Z06, you guys talked about how the LS7 came about and some of the development goals of knowing why it had to be 7 liters or how it got to 7 liters and why you were going for that over 500 horsepower mark. Can you take me back to that late 2000s time period when you guys thought about Gen 5 motors and going supercharged from NA?
Yeah, I'll start. I do want to mention, though, that, Jack, I'm glad you asked. I saw your earlier list of questions, and when I saw your one question on the fuel system, I was glad Dustin was going to be on the call because he was the DRE on the fuel system. So for me, I've had the really good fortune to work with all of these folks for about 22 years now in Small Block. So I'm starting with Yoon and Dustin and Mike in like 2000, 2002. So all of us go way back, and we all have a passion and love for Small Block engines. So long ago, C7 development, I came into the program as an assistant chief on truck in 2000. Let's see, when was it? 2008. I think.
And Gen 2009, I think, Jordan.
2009.
Yeah.
I was assistant chief on trucks, and then I was fortunate to get the chief job in 2010. But at that time, the Gen 5 was starting. We call it architectural work, balanced architectural work, where we're framing up what we want the engine to be. Taj, who's the chief, he always had a premise where he wanted the next generation's engines to be equal to the last generation's performance upgrade. So in this instance, the C6 Z06 was 505 horsepower. The ZR1 was 638, I believe, with the LS9 engine. And by virtue of his premise, he said, well, the Z06 for the C7 ought to be what the ZR1 makes, which was about 638. So we were actually aiming for about 625 horsepower, but we knew that we were going to be a little architecturally limited with a pushrod 2-valve engine and getting enough airflow to make 630 plus horsepower, 625 plus horsepower without a supercharger. So we knew from the very beginning we were going to have to go with forced induction. Front engine cars, Corvette in particular, there's not a lot of room to put an engine in the front of a Corvette and still be able to see over the hood. If you've driven a ZR1, C7 ZR1 with the LT5 engine, you kind of get a pretty good idea. When the engine gets a little bit bigger, it gets pretty hard to see over the hood. So we were really struggling to come up with a very compact supercharger for the LT4 in that time frame. And one of the hallmarks of the LT4, and I do love the engine. I have a fondness for it. I think it's one of the most power dense, compact small blocks we've ever done. Relative to the LT1 that you know pretty well after your last segment on the Camaro, the LT4 was only an inch higher. The supercharger was made extremely compact. You worked very closely with the engineers who were developing that supercharger, and we were quite proud of the fact that it was so compact. But yeah, we knew from the very beginning it was going to be forced induction. And I think, as far as the supercharged part of it, since that predated me coming on in 2009, was that a given from the very beginning? Would you remember?
You mean as far as the type of forced induction?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's always going to be a supercharged.
Okay.
Yeah, the
Jack, I know
turbos
you were
wouldn't
asking-
fit right around the frame rails, Ian. I think that was
Yeah,
a
I
big
mean,
part of it.
It's probably not surprising to hear that we had studied twin turbos in the past at GM on small blocks. This is probably going back 20 plus years, but we always had an issue with packaging with twin turbos. And if you've seen the LT7, you see how wide that engine is. It wasn't going to be much better with a push-rod engine.
Yeah, there's just not a lot of room between the front wheels in a front engine car, Jack, and anywhere you could stuff a turbocharger would result in really long plumbing, and then you'd have turbo lag and all the pitfalls that occurred with that. We did look at a lot of aftermarket systems. Actually, in C6 era, there was a car you may have heard called the Blue Devil, which was a turbocharged variant for a concept car to try and get more performance. And ironically, Tony Roma was one of the engineers who was working on that car, trying to get the concept put together. But it still was kind of a mishmash on where you could stick the turbos, and it just didn't work that well.
So
not a lot of
packaging was the
packaging
biggest
for turbo.
constraint.
What's that?
Packaging was the biggest constraint of that.
Biggest constraint, yeah. And if you look at some of the competitors with twin turbo V8s today in front engine cars, they put the turbos in the valley. Big reason for that is the packaging. Just too hard to do on the outside.
So thinking of from the development perspective, the Gen 5 engines versus the Gen 4, obviously you went from port to DI. How much of the architecture was carryover? In the case of like the LSA and the LS9 engines, how much of that understanding or engineering know-how filtered into the LT4 and like the LT1? What was that development process like going from the LS motors to the LTs?
It was a monumental change in architecture. I mean, conceptually it's the same, but when we introduced the LT1 to the world, we had a lunch baggie with the common parts between Gen 4 to Gen 5, and there were starter bolts and I think circlips. There weren't very many. But once the decision was made to go direct injection, everything was going to change. The block was going to be quite a bit different. It needed to have provisions to mount the fuel system. Dustin, maybe you can talk a bit about what you went through in trying to get that fuel pump mounted and keep the stresses under control on the cam lobe.
Yeah, well, the LT4 from the DI perspective was an evolution from the base Gen 5. So as you said, Jordan, when we redid the block architecture to support a DI pump, which those that know the engine, right, it runs on the back of the camshaft in the valley at the very back of the block. So it's integrated into the block itself. And then back to Jordan's comments about a compact engine and supercharger design, one of the big motivations to stay DI only. Jack, you want to talk a little bit about PFI, combo systems. When you add the PFI system, the supercharger, you get closer to what the LT5 solution was, and you raise that upper limit of the engine much higher up. So our goal was to get all the fuel we needed for the 650 horsepower plus the supercharger losses out of a single piston DI pump, because we were packaged into that with the block structure. So we actually grew the diameter of the pump and the stroke of the pump over what's in the base Gen 5s. And part of that was really pushing the valve train to its limits to support that at peak fuel flow. So we developed a whole new pump. Internally, we nicknamed it throughout the development. It was called the Mega Pump that we were going to do because it was going to be the biggest one out there. And I dug up in the history there. I started originally looking at the packaging for that and the cam stresses on that back in 2009. So we put a lot of years into the fuel pump alone, like we did the LT4 to get it where it was.
Yeah. Hey, Jack, also, with regard to the common content, since Mike was the lead, I'm going to drag Mike into the conversation. He orchestrated and led all the builds between the Gen 4s and the Gen 5s at the time. So, Mike, maybe you have some perspective on some of the differences.
Yeah, so obviously with Gen 5, there was a lot of effort going into lube and vent systems and packaging as always with the dance around some of the fuel injection systems. And anytime we're trying to do a forced induction type system, there's a lot of complexity, a lot of durability components, that need to be upgraded. And that was a focus from the very beginning. But at its heart, of course, we know this engine, it's got to have a lot of fun factor. So, trying to tailor certain elements like, what's the torque curve got to look like, et cetera. And that's what this engine, I think, really does well and really still resonates with our customers. I know it's one of my favorites. The way it's integrated into the Z06, it's fantastic, as well as a lot of our other variants that carry the LT4. The way Americans drive on our roads, you've got torque right off off of idle. And if you want to burn your tires down at a stoplight or do anything like that, it certainly delivers. And that was an emphasis from the beginning, trying to make sure that it really had that character. And it really took what we had on LS7, which was largely, displacement is king, right? Well, for that we couldn't quite get all the way to 7 liters on the Gen 5 application. So, going to supercharged and executing the torque curve. So, it certainly felt much larger than it did. And as you've driven both, I'm sure. It really delivers on all those promises.
So Jack, Mike was being kind. He said fun factor. The real term we all use internally is pucker factor. If the car scares you, the pucker factor is nice and high. And a scary experience is kind of a fun thing.
It was the first car I ever drove at Milford where the chassis control system wasn't working yet, and it was a wet day. And I realized you really have to respect this car. You can't just get in it and mash the throttle. You've got to treat it gently. There's a certain violence to it that adds to that pucker element for sure.
When you're developing an engine like this, particularly in an emotional, this is not, I jokingly say these are not the kind of engines that pay the bills at General Motors. These are emotional drivetrains you're putting in performance applications. How much do you look towards the past of what those things felt like, the response from your engineers and your customers, and try to re-emulate that or improve upon it in products like this? Because the LS9 and the ZR1, the C6 era, or the LSA motors and the Caddies were very well loved, to say the least. And they had a very distinct character, whether it be the blower whine and the way they built torque, basically in a flat line. Were you looking to just emulate that and make more power in this generation, or are you looking for a different character? How does that sort of, from a development perspective, how do you decide the character of a motor?
Well, Jordan, maybe let me answer first.
Yeah.
What I would first say is the LT4 doesn't happen in the as effectively as it did without the LSA and without the LS9 and some of the other predecessors. The learnings, especially in the supercharger, early in the 2000s, we were kind of stuck with the certain design elements that we thought were absolutely infallible, that you couldn't design around, like aspect ratio of the rotor set, et cetera. And some of the coatings and other things that those earlier programs were able to develop kind of opened the doors to say, what more could we do? And obviously the LT4 learned from those examples and then take it to a whole nother level. So, right off the bat, you can learn from those prior examples and figure out, like, okay, how can we really maximize, those capability, get more efficiency out of the supercharger, which, you get more flow, less temperature, all those things, were tremendous in making sure we started off from the right foot.
Ewan, do you have any comments? I know you had a lot of experience with the LS9 supercharger. You released that part, and then the LT4.
I was going to mention that, Jordan. So obviously I have a little bit more than just familiarity with the LS9, the LSA, since I was the design engineer on that supercharger. Kind of to build on what Mike said, I mean, I kind of look at LT4 as kind of the evolution of the LS9, right? We're just building upon something that was already really pretty spectacular to start with. But I can tell you that when we're doing the LS9 program, some of the older supercharger technologies out there, the rotors were 3-lobe instead of 4-lobe, and they weren't as efficient. Just the amount of power required to drive the older 3-loop superchargers was going to be quite high. I mean, some of the initial studies we did, and even the drive belts that we needed for the power targets that we wanted to hit, it was going to be quite a challenge just to make everything fit. So when we were presented with the opportunity to do the 4-lobe, that opened up a lot of possibilities, and we could get the airflow that we wanted in the package size that we needed for that program. So, and then the LT4 just kind of built upon that.
So Jack, it's probably worth noting the LS9, it was a 2300 supercharger, so
Yeah.
2300 cc's per revolution. We went much smaller on the LT4 because we had to meet a PED protection requirement in Europe. That forced us to come up with an even smaller supercharger. I think that we originally started with something like 1650 or something like that, Yoon. And ended up
No,
at
I think we started with I don't remember if we started smaller than that, but we ended up with the 1740.
40.
Yeah.
We did start with a smaller, and it just wasn't making the power for us. So we went as large as we could and still meet that PED Pro. Now, ironically, when we launched the car, somebody realized we didn't have to meet that PED Pro requirement because our sales volume was low enough that we could get an exclusion. So we did make some modifications to the supercharger lid for the 17 model year to make the intercooling a little bit more effective. But yeah, a lot of that was trying to meet regulation. But as you mentioned, it was really a challenge to make that 1740 supercharger meet the performance of the LS9 or get close to it. They both make it pretty much the same peak boost, around 9.5 psi or so. But having the smaller displacement resulted in a lot higher revving. I think I'm sure if you remember, was it 20,000 RPM? I think we had on the LT4, maybe 15,000.
Yeah, the LT4, we had a higher rotor speed limit than the LS9. The LS9 was limited to about 16,000 RPM, and the LS7, the LT4 probably went push that closer to 20,000. Because again, with
20,600, I think is the number. 20,600 is what I remember.
Yeah, it was around 20,000.
Yeah.
Because as you
it's actually 20,150. And I know because I have my old presentation up on another screen, so I can look at the
Cheater.
Just to take a step back from the viewer perspective, and I'll get to you as well, Dustin. Can you explain the advantage to a layman going from a 3 to a 4 rotor in the blower design? What advantage that gives you guys from an engineering perspective, and then as well, Dustin, the requirements or the benefits of going from port to DI. Obviously, you can get more fuel into the car, but is that the pure advantage from a forced induction application from going from port to DI?
I grab the supercharger.
Yeah. Do you want to talk about the supercharger first, Jack, or do the fuel system?
Whatever's easier for you to kind of.
All right.
Camera's on you. You can go.
All right. As I mentioned before, the advantage of the 4 rotor versus the 3 is that you can get more airflow with better efficiency at a lower parasitic load or drive requirement. And when you talk superchargers, or really any compressor, when you talk efficiency, you're really talking about temperature. So you're getting more airflow that you've heated less, and you're requiring less power from the engine to deliver that. So that's really what the benefit of the 4 rotor or 4 lobe rotor gave you over the 3. So by going from a 3 to a 4, you could make the superchargers either smaller or equivalent size, but you can get more airflow, and you can do that without heating the air as much, and you require less power from the engine to drive it.
Everyone you're talking to today and those you're not talking to, we're just all passionate gearheads. We love Corvettes and engines. It's been a big part of our career and our lives. And we just always want cars to be something that we find just fascinating, scintillating, and just a thrill to drive. So the LS9 was that. It was for me. The LS7 too. I think Mike and Yoon and Dustin agree. So for LT4, we just wanted more of everything. We never met a horsepower we didn't like. So more power is something we always go after. But we have some really talented NVH engineers too that get the sounds just perfect. The exhaust sound, for example, the engine sound, the mechanical cacophony, all that stuff is very additive. It doesn't happen by accident. There's a lot of engineering work that goes into making it what it is.
All right, before we head to Autobahn Country Club and tear up one of these cars on the track, I thought it was important I walk you through what these things are like to live with on the street. And this will be a better place for me to explain to you some of the intricacies of how this car handles, how it feels compared to a C7 Grand Sport or my C8 Z06, and I won't have the pressure of not crashing a somewhat twitchy car at the racetrack. So with that, let's launch this thing slowly. Not my car. Traction problems already. All right, as you probably are guessing, this car is very much so dominated by its supercharged V8. It makes all the right noises. It has an incredible amount of horsepower and torque, and I'm going to be honest, in the real world, most of the time, you will be struggling for traction, but it does leave you with a giant smile on your face. When it comes to gearing, this manual has very long gears, much longer than my C7 Grand Sport did. First gear's over 60. Second gear is almost 90 miles an hour. This is very, very tallly geared. Third gear, you're basically never going to hit that if you want to maintain your license. You're looking at 120, 130 in the top of third. Very, very long gears. Though, honestly, in this car, doesn't really matter. You have torque and power everywhere. Basically, this engine makes power in two flat lines. You have almost all your torque instantaneously. Once you get to the torque band, you have all your horsepower. The engine revs about 6,500 RPM. And one of the great things about this thing, unlike the C8 Z06, is you get a lot of heavy fourth order noise, and none of it is fake. It's all, as you're about to listen to, America. God damn. All right. That domination of the engine plays a lot into the chassis dynamics of this car as well, even on the road. Because there's so much torque in this car, you entirely drive the C7 Z06. Doesn't matter what tire you're on or conditions around the rear. As breathe the gas sideways. It's a car you're managing the rear. There's a bit of edginess to that, whereas in the C7 Grand Sport, in my case, I had 315 fronts, 335 rears, so it was essentially an entirely neutral experience. It would understeer or oversteer based upon your stupidity or your mistakes. The C8 Z06, once the tires come up to temp and you're not running a Cup 2Rs, it's a car you drive around the front of the vehicle. Unless you're really greedy with the throttle, it's not really an oversteery car. You wait for the front to turn in, then you apply gas liberally. This is eggshell driving. You essentially squeeze the gas versus dab it, because if you give it a bunch of throttle, the back will step out, even at low speeds. It does make this car very, very exciting to drive. It may not be everybody's cup of tea because it's arguably a little bit nervous, but it's theater, which this car has in spades. It is a deeply, deeply satisfying car to drive. In many ways, on the street, I prefer driving this to my C8 Z06 from a theater perspective. Yes, it doesn't have the noise of the bees that the LT6 makes, and you can maybe argue that this big burly V8 is a less special sounding experience. But because you feel more in the chassis, and I'm going to talk about that in the track section, this car communicates more of what it's doing to you than in the C8 Z06. That car is more isolated. The architecture does a better job isolating you from road imperfections, but conversely, it has less feel. You know, this car, you don't have brake-by-wire, so the brake pedal translates everything to you that the front and the rear wheels are doing. The steering, I think, is a little bit more connected than the C8 is. It's just a very, very engaging, theatrical car to drive. Essentially, supercar with a 7-speed manual and this much character. So with that, as we've run up here on a Lexus, it's time to head to Autobahn Country Club. Mark, that is a proper sound, sir. Some PTM already activating because it already wants to get loose. Oh. Oh, yeah. Wait for it. Oh, yeah. This is like everything I want in an American car. Yeah. C7 Z06, Z07 package, manual 2015. A good friend of mine's car, Jabron's, kind enough or stupid enough to let me drive around Autobahn South. So, how does it feel from the passenger seat, sir?
Oh my god, I'm so sick already, dude. I'm glad I wore my sweatpants so I could hose them out after I fucking leaked stool everywhere.
All right, let's talk about the engine. Just listen. Long gears, 650 horsepower, the same amount of torque. It is the entire experience of the C7 Z06, just like in the C8 Z06. Chassis balance, unlike in my old Grand Sport, you drive around the throttle. It is what I remember being even longer gears. 120 into this corner, Mark, onto the brakes. Coming in, PTM sorts out most of the traction issues. We're in race. Double wishbone front end works well. Better steering than my C8 Z06. And because this is an old car, you feel so much in the chassis. And you just listen to V8. Any questions or thoughts, sir?
No, just get me out of here.
One more corner, Mark.
Oh, God.
Is it the seats?
Oh my god, dude, I don't know. I'm leaking vomit already. What's coming up? I think it's a combination of the seats. I can't keep my body straight in the seat at all. Like I am literally a rag doll in the fucking seat. Ugh.
Final thoughts on the C7 Z06 Corvette. First off, we have to thank some people who made this video possible. Folks from General Motors, like Jordan, Trevor, Kiana, and the rest of the LT4 small block engineering team who assisted us in teaching you about the history of the LT4 and walked us through some of the technical details behind the C7 Z06. We also have to thank our title sponsor for this video, Autotempest. Autotempest is a search engine that allows you to find cars easier. Finding specific models of vehicles or model years is incredibly difficult. So the reason we partnered with Autotempest is a tool that can actually help you. It essentially is a search engine aggregate. You can search essentially every listing for a car from multiple different sites in one location. It makes finding cars like the C7 Z06, which have specific model years you want, trim levels and options, easier to locate. And they are an enthusiast-led search engine. The people behind the website love cars, which makes videos like this possible. So please thank them in our comments. And of course, we have to thank Autobahn Country Club, the track that gives us a home to shoot videos like this. So if you're looking to become a member, do a track day, or join their Autobahn Driving Academy or driving program, please hit them up and visit their website. So what about the car itself? Well, as someone who's owned a C7 and currently owns a C8 Z06, this car pickles me. It has a ton of character. I've driven the C5, C6, C7, and of course the C8 Z06. This is very unique. This is, of all of those cars, the one that is probably dominated by the engine the most. Not only is it all-encompassing when you're on throttle, it also changes the chassis balance of the car. It's a vehicle that you definitely drive around the rear, which makes it exciting and honestly raw. It's an experience that is honestly missing from modern cars. You can't buy another manual 650 foot-pounds of torque front-engine V8. And when you drive this car, flaws aside, it makes you giggle and smile like you're a little kid. And I think that's the best thing about this thing. Are they expensive on the used market? Are they going to be hard on consumables? Do you have to buy the correct model? Yes, it's a more complicated car to buy, but if you find the right one, there's really nothing else like it. And I really enjoyed my time behind the wheel of this vehicle. Huge thanks to both of the owners who provided us their cars. So thanks for watching. Hope to see you again soon.